Oh, wow. We've got a lot of people popping in here already. Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today, we will be talking about vagus nerve stimulation and its potential to provide a transformative treatment for our loved ones who struggle with temper tantrums and disruptive behaviors. Joining us today, we have Dr. Lauren Schwartz. She's a clinical psychologist and member of FPWR's research team. Dr. Schwartz has been the driving force behind FPWR's work to improve mental health and behavior, and for those with PWS. She's developed several resources for our PWS community, including FPWR's mental health guidebook and social skills tip sheets, which have been utilized widely by parents and clinicians. Also joining us is Dr. Tony Holland, a psychiatrist and professor emeritus at the University of Cambridge. He has dedicated his long career to research and clinical work in the areas of PWS and Down syndrome. He was one of the first researchers to consider the use of VNS to help improve behaviors and independence in PWS, and we are excited to have him joining us today. Today's panelists will provide a background on VNS and its current indications, insight into the benefits we have observed to date using VNS as a treatment in PWS, and finally, details on the clinical trial FPWR is advancing with the aim of making this treatment available to our community. As always, we do want to hear from you, so please send us your questions through Zoom's question submission box, and we will answer as many of your questions as we can at the end of our presentation. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Lauren, perhaps you could help get us started by explaining for us what is the vagus nerve and how does it play into one's behavior?
Yes, thanks, Susan. So the vagus nerve is part of our nervous system. It's actually a very long nerve that extends from the brain all the way down to our abdomen, and it carries a large number of signals from the brain to the digestive system and then vice versa. And it's the main part of the parasympathetic nervous system, which, as some of you might know, is considered the rest and digest part of the autonomic nervous system, which you could think of as the other side of fight or flight, which is also the other part of the autonomic nervous system. And the vagal nerve is involved in a large number of bodily functions, including our immune response, digestion, our heart rate, and it also influences mood. So as a result, it's become a really attractive target for treating some psychiatric and mood disorders, as well as some GI disorders. And there's evidence that stimulation of the vagus nerve can be helpful for treating refractory depression, seizures, post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's been some studies looking at GI disorders as well.
That's very interesting. So has VNS been safe in these other indications, and have there been any concerns for its use?
It has been used in depression, as I mentioned, and also in seizure disorders, and is being piloted for use in other disorders. And it is considered, has been considered safe to use. Some people have had some mild side effects. There are two different sort of forms of VNS stimulation. One is an implantable device. That's a small device that's implanted in kind of the chest, neck area. And the other one is an external device that is kind of like an earbud. You wear it on your ear and it stimulates the nerve that way. So the study we're talking about today is going to be using the external device that goes on the ear. Actually, I think it's the left ear. That device has been used in some studies that Dr. Holland's going to talk about. And there have been some mild side effects, such as some redness or a little bit of irritation in the ear, but nothing too intolerable. And we don't expect to see any concerns in the larger study that we're proposing. But obviously, it's one of the reasons we need to do a study, is to not only look at the effectiveness of this potential treatment, but also to see if there are any concerns or challenges that come up.
Thank you. Dr. Holland, you were one of the first clinicians to try using VNS to help people with PWS. Can you tell us why you first had this idea to study VNS?
Yes, I mean, the initial idea was to use VNS to see if it would help the overeating, the hyperphagia that is so characteristic of people with Prader-Willi syndrome. And the reason for that, is Lauren has touched on, is that the vagus nerve, part of its function is providing feedback between the gut and the brain so that the brain knows when someone has eaten. And it's really part of what is referred to as the satiety cascade, the process whereby when we eat, we lose our sense of hunger and we stop eating. And when we first thought about using vagus nerve stimulation, we thought, well, let's try it in people with Prader-Willi syndrome to see if it would stop the overeating. And interestingly, we looked into the literature on epilepsy because, again, as Lauren mentioned, vagus nerve stimulation has been approved for many years for treating epilepsy. It's been shown to be very safe in doing that. But what we found is that there were hints in that literature that people who happened to be having it for epilepsy, if they happened also to be obese, they often lost weight. So we were really rather excited by that. And our first study actually used, again, Lauren mentioned this, the older device, the implanted device, which is about the size of a pacemaker, again, implanted under the chest. And then a wire runs up under the skin and is wound around the vagus nerve as it runs through the neck on the left side. But our aim was to see, would it help the overeating? And we had 3 people, and of course, this is asking people to have a general anesthetic and to have a device implanted. So it's a big thing to ask of people. But 3 people with Prader-Willi syndrome volunteered to have it. They had the surgery, they had it implanted. And again, something that's worth emphasizing is in treatment of things like epilepsy, vagus nerve stimulation takes a long time to have an effect. So we knew we should be patient. And the 3 volunteers had it switched on and it stimulated the vagus nerve and they tolerated it very well. But they didn't really have any change in their eating, much to our disappointment. But after, I think it was about 3 or 4 months, both 2 of the 3 people came to us and their parents and said, it's not helping the eating, but it's transformed their behavior. They're no longer having temper outbursts. The person who didn't change didn't really have behaviors beforehand, so there wasn't anything to improve. And we got really excited by this. I mean, it was one of those, if you like, eureka moments, almost a serendipitous observation that these 2 people with Prader-Willi syndrome and their parents had made. Of course, the problem was we hadn't collected data on behavior because it was about eating. So it was a little difficult to sort of convince people that this was the effect, but I was very struck by it. And then when we came to do the next study, by then this external device that Lauren mentioned, where you wear the electrode in your left ear, became available. And we thought ethically it was more appropriate to use that. And this time, of course, we focused very specifically on the behavior. And I can go on and say more about that in a moment, whenever you like.
I think my face just lit up when you started telling us about the 2 improvements of those people. I remember hearing or reading your paper from that, and I thought in my mind, like, this is it. I need this for my son. And so
a lot of people have said that to me. Yes.
Study, right? And so, yes, let's talk about it. It was with an external device, and you had a few more participants this time. And what did you see now?
On that, now, one of the things just to say we discovered about the external device is that, of course, it does require the cooperation of the people with Prader-Willi syndrome, whereas the other one, once you've had it implanted, well, it's there and that's it. And one of the struggles, of course, was by definition, we wanted people with Prader-Willi syndrome who had very difficult behavior. And so by definition, they were going to be a difficult group to engage in the trial. So we set ourselves rather modest objectives. And that was, and FPWR funded this study, is that we said we would try and get 6 participants through the whole trial, expecting again that it would take some months to have an effect. In fact, we got 5 completed the trial, and 4 of them showed significant improvements, albeit after, we think that the improvement probably began after about 6 months of stimulation. So they wore this device and the stimulation, the electrode in the ear for 4 hours each day over these months. But what we found is that the number of outbursts began to get lower, the severity of the outbursts got lower. And I think you have a PowerPoint with some of the sort of examples of the speech bubbles of what parents described to us about the effects of this form of vagus nerve stimulation. That's right. So these are just 3 examples. You know, in a way, he doesn't know what he's doing and he can't control it, referring to the outburst. And then they say after the VNS, something just clicks and he just calms. And I can remember, just to give another example, that when we were doing this, a parent described to us how they were in town with their son, and the mother said, "Look, we need to get home a bit early. I'm running late and I've got things I have to do." And she said, "I thought he was going to have a massive outburst because this was a change in what he was expecting, and he just accepted it." We had these sorts of stories, and here they're illustrated here. Now he can listen, be prepared to sit and listen. And that was one of the interesting observations, is that as you as parents will know better than me, that sometimes if you can't do something about it within those first seconds or minutes, it gets beyond your control, the outburst. But what they were describing is that the person, it was possible to intervene. So you could see them beginning to get a little upset, and you might prompt them to do something to help them calm, and they would be willing to do it. Whereas before, they would get so uptight so quickly that you'd lost it at that point, and it was very difficult to recover the situation. So these were all very interesting, and of the 4 out of the 5 people who improved, 3 are continuing to use it. The other person didn't like the device very much, and she has been referred to have an implanted device and is waiting to have an implanted device because she felt it helped her so much. She wants to have it. She just didn't like to have the external device. The 3 that are using the external device are still, as far as we can tell, are benefiting from them. I keep some informal contact with them.
So we have a picture here of what a device looks like. Perhaps you could talk us through
Yes.
how is this applied? Right.
So you could see the external stimulator on the left, which is now actually much more advanced than it was when we did our study. Just to say that this is manufactured in Germany, and the company was taken over around the time of that first study. And actually, they've got a very committed group of engineers who have been working on developing this further. And I think that's a really exciting thing. It's sort of the size of a mobile phone. It's a little thicker perhaps than a mobile phone. And as you can see from one of our participants, the way they wore it was just on a band that often runners use to carry their phone when they're out running. And then the wire, you can see, runs up. And the electrode is a little like a hearing aid. It sits in a particular part of the ear, and it stimulates what's called the auricular branch of the vagus nerve. So it's a branch of the vagus nerve that runs from the ear into and connects with the main vagus nerve. And so you can see the wire. And as I say, they wear it for 4 hours each day, and it switches on and off during that time. And they usually get a little tingling in the ear, but not much more than that. And one of the things we've learned is if you can help the person incorporate it into their daily routine, they don't have to wear it for 4 hours continuously. They can wear it half an hour or preferably an hour at a time. But if they can, if their routine is they could wear it over breakfast or something, and then again in the evening for some further time, then that's easier for them. But we did find, as I mentioned, that early on that a few people we recruited, they had temper outbursts or whatever, and they said, "We're not going to do this," and they threw it and so on. So that early task of engaging people in the study was quite a challenge because of the nature of the device and having to wear it. But though once people got used to it, it was very acceptable.
So now that you've conducted 2 studies in a number of individuals, what do you believe the opportunity is for VNS for the PWS community?
Right. I mean, I think there are 2, in a sense, exciting components to this. I mean, first of all, there's the obvious one that there is a potential treatment here for, I think, what most parents will describe as probably now the most challenging aspect of caring for someone with Prader-Willi syndrome. I think it's fair to say that many feel they can manage the hyperphagia, but what they can't so easily manage are the outbursts. So there's a potential here for a treatment that is used and has been used extensively in other areas such as epilepsy, that is known to be safe. But as Lauren said, we do need to check that because we don't know whether people with Prader-Willi syndrome could respond atypically or anything like that to it. But I think that's the first thing. There's a real potential treatment there. But I think there's a second aspect is I think that one of the challenges with Prader-Willi syndrome is whilst we know the problems very well, and for some of them there are treatments, we don't really understand why they occur. And I think what vagus nerve stimulation has taught me is that it's something about, as Lauren mentioned, the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system. There's something about the inability of the person with Prader-Willi syndrome to regulate what I call their response to challenge or to harm in some way. So they're faced some unexpected change that they find very challenging. They get very quickly upset. That what the vagus nerve stimulation seems to do is reset the autonomic nervous system. So it's sort of more normalized. All of us could be pushed to have outbursts, but by and large, we're fairly resilient and we cope with most things that life throws at us. But for people with Prader-Willi syndrome, I think their threshold for that is much lower. It doesn't take much to tip them over the edge. Vagus nerve stimulation raises that threshold and helps to normalize it. So it's telling us something about mechanisms that I think is really important.
Yeah. Tony, it really is. It sounds like a very opportunistic treatment for our loved ones. You know, I think about the challenges our family faces, and behavior is one of them. You don't want to trip the wire when it comes to our son. And oftentimes his behaviors dictate whether we can do a planned activity or not. So when I think about, you know, the anxiety that's kind of underlying that behavior, I really, you know, it sounds like VNS could potentially help with that. So for most of you, you are very familiar with Dr. Theresa Strong, but for those who are not, Dr. Strong is the founder of FPWR and our director of research programs. Theresa is an accomplished geneticist who, prior to joining FPWR full-time in 2016, focused on developing gene therapy approaches for cancer. She is currently leading our efforts to advance a VNS clinical trial. So welcome, Theresa, and thank you for joining us today. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the trial that FPWR is planning, why FPWR has prioritized advancing this trial, and maybe a little bit about why you're personally excited about this study. That's a lot.
Yeah. So I'll start with the personally excited because that's probably the easiest. You know, I have a young adult son with PWS, and, you know, he's in many ways quite high functioning, but there is so much that he can't do or that we keep him from doing because I worry about his inability to control his temper, right? So, I mean, he's a grown man now, he's got a beard, and, you know, if we're out in public and, you know, he gets tipped over into, you know, an outburst, I mean, it's a real problem. People are scared, and, you know, I know it's mostly just noise, but it's pretty aggressive noise. And so, because of that, we really limit, you know, where we go as a family, his opportunities for work, his opportunities to socialize in the community, all of that is really limited. And I think the other thing is he doesn't like being like that. You know, I mean, he doesn't, you know, he recognizes that it's different from most other people. You know, he feels bad afterwards. He, you know, typically blames me, but he still feels bad about it. And so it's an unhappy situation for everybody. It's limiting for his life. It's not pleasant to be around. It's not pleasant for anybody in the family. And Susan, as you said, it's a lot of walking on eggshells in our house, because we don't want to poke the bear, so to speak. And nobody enjoys it. So I mean, I'm excited because it's an opportunity. What is very attractive to me, as Tony has said, is this potential to improve his cognitive flexibility, his ability to essentially take a breath and rather than go shooting up into an outburst, just sort of settle and wait things out. And I feel like if he were able to do that, it would address a major issue in our lives. I mean, yes, and so many of our discussions and things that go badly are around food also. I feel like while it may not help the actual eating, it might help us work more cooperatively so that, the food is less of an issue. So that's my personal thing. When I look at data from our community, when people talking about like, what are the things that are important to me, it's very clear that, not all individuals with PWS have these outbursts, but it's a good number. And when people do have the outbursts, it's a big impact on the family. So I think, I understand it from my personal situation, looking at the data, where hundreds of you have, said what's important to me. This is a very important thing for a pretty good percent of our population. So I think it's a way to address one of the biggies, as far as challenges go. So, when we saw this data that Tony and his colleagues had generated, of course, we were very interested in it. And, with this clinical trial that we're working on developing, what we hope to do, Tony's obviously done a great job in a small number, and now we'd like to really show that is applicable to a larger population, and get this to the point where there's sort of substantial evidence that it works, and also give us an opportunity, as we've said, to make sure that that the safety is good. So safety has been good in the small number of individuals who have used to date, but we'd like to increase that. So we've been working with Dr. Holland, with others in the field, Dr. Deese, Dr. Koenig, who are experts in TVNS, in developing a protocol so that we can really look at these aspects in a larger population and get the data into the medical literature so that if this is, as we hope, a safe and effective therapy, that it can be accessible to anyone who has this problem of temper outbursts. So I'll pause there. I don't know if I answered everything you asked.
Susan, can I just follow up on one point of what I mean, just this issue of the eating. One of the interesting things we observed is people said to us, it may not have directly affected the eating, but it did do exactly what you described, Theresa, that it was possible to negotiate. So the parent was able to say to their this was actually on the first trial with the implanted eye, able to say to their daughter, don't you think we should work together and have a diet, a diet plan? And she said yes. Whereas before she would have said, oh, I don't want to diet, I don't need to diet, I'm not eating too much, and so on. So, I mean, I think there may be indirect benefits in very much the way that you've just described.
Yeah, that's the issue. We have my son's in his 20s. He does not want his mother telling him what to eat. And so it is a source of a lot of conflict. And I feel like, yeah, if that temper were tamped down a little bit, we might be able to have better discussions around it.
I think that aspect, Tony, you mentioned of cognitive flexibility, it may be improving that's part of it's addressing that sort of black and white thinking and being able to collaborate and discuss.
Yes.
Is very, obviously would be helpful for many arenas. Yeah.
I mean, I think that all this does indicate the need for a much larger trial. I mean, first of all, we need to be certain that what we observed is observed in a larger and more substantial trial. But I think also there are important questions about if it does bring benefit, how does it bring benefit? What is it that changes that allows the person then to better control their behavior? So I think there is so much to be learned from a larger trial, and certainly with that second trial, one person didn't respond and he clearly had behavior problems. What is it about those people who don't respond? So are there responders and non-responders, and how do we understand that? He happened to be actually older, quite a bit older than the other participants, and we wondered whether that might be a factor. But I think there are, beyond just the issue of does it work or not, which is obviously crucially important so that you can get approval and insurance cover and so on, there are interesting questions about what changes that brings the benefit.
So Theresa, maybe we could chat a little bit about the study that's being planned.
Sure. So we're still in the planning stages. So, just a caveat that there might be some changes as, we get additional input. But right now we're looking at a study for individuals age 10 and over. And we chose age 10 because, kids have temper outbursts, and that's sort of a normal part of development. And we felt like the older kids having temper outbursts, that's where it really starts to diverge from the normal when we're continuing to have temper outbursts into the teen years. So we thought that would be, our goal here is to show the efficacy and show the safety, hopefully, and and be able to move forward. So we will be looking for, and we're not ready to open yet. That's coming in a couple of months, but we thought it would be good to kind of, introduce the community to what's coming. So we would be looking for individuals age 10 and above, and those who do have temper outbursts on a regular basis, because we have to be able to measure whether it improves. So we'll be asking families to document that, essentially documenting, the frequency and intensity of the outbursts. And then we'll split into groups, some of whom get treatment right away, some of whom, are potentially delayed in the start of their treatment, and they'll get the device and they'll do the stimulation. As Dr. Holland said, I think we'll be doing 4 hours a day, although there'll be some different dosing as far as how the stimulation is set. So we can look at, whether sort of more is better or not. And we'll do that over a number of months. I mean, as Tony said, a challenge of this approach is that it takes a while to see an effect. And so we'll be looking over the course of the entire trial will likely take about a year. So, we'll get people enrolled, we'll get them doing the stimulation. There'll be some measures that they have to do. We'll look for a decrease in the behaviors. And there'll be a treatment period that covers, or probably the entire period will cover about a year from start to end. So that's a very high level. Again, all subject to change as we continue to ask experts for input and, modify the design a little bit, but that's a high level.
Sure. Do you anticipate that there might be any challenges with the study?
There's always challenges with studies, right? I mean, one of I think the nice things is we really want to make this as remote as possible so that, families aren't having to come into a clinic on a regular basis. I think the fact that, there is a history of using these devices in other populations with a good safety record will be helpful for that. So, the assessments will be remote. So we'll be using, sort of a mobile phone to monitor the outbursts and do some other questionnaires about behaviors. So we're really trying to decrease the burden on families. That said, it does require that an individual use the device 4 hours per day, minimum of 2 hours, but we hope to get 4 hours per day. Right now, my first question was, can we stick it on when they're sleeping? That's not been done. So we think we're going to have to stick with, during waking hours because it can move when you're sleeping. So that is going to be a challenge for families. And as Tony said, those who have the worst or the most challenging behaviors are often those who are not excited about, cooperating in a clinical trial. So we expect that not everybody will be able to, get in and sort of do all the steps, but I think, Tony, you may want to comment. For some individuals, I think you had the feeling, at least, that after a little while, maybe they were starting to feel better because they became a little bit more cooperative about using the device. And so we're hoping for a little bit of that grace as we move into the treatment period.
I mean, just to say, I think that's right. It's difficult to say, but I think there were people who were still having outbursts, but somehow they just seemed to be more engaged with the study. And we just wondered in retrospect whether they were just themselves beginning to feel some benefit, which they may not have been able to articulate themselves, but perhaps a little less anxious or whatever, which meant that they were more engaged with the study and more willing to continue. And then as the stimulation, as the weeks went by, then you got the more obvious benefit in terms of the reduction in outbursts.
Sure. So I just shared my screen just briefly, just to give, again, a very highlight view of what the trial may look like. 50 plus volunteers from across the US who will wear the device daily for the duration of the study. The participants do need to have a history of temper outbursts so that we can measure the benefits. We are trying to design the study so that it's primarily virtual visits to limit the amount of travel that will be required. And caregivers will need to complete a daily diary as part of the study. You'll find a QR code here on this slide. If you want information about the study or you would wish to support it, please use that QR code and you'll find more information. So, Dr. Holland, Theresa, Lauren, they have been pivotal to making this trial possible. Dr. Holland's first defining the benefits of this, and then Lauren and Theresa in helping to define a protocol along with Dr. Holland. But now it's really in the hands of our PWS community if we're going to ensure its success. In addition to the trial participants that will be needed to complete this study, we need the support of our community to ensure funding for the completion of this trial. We anticipate the VNS for PWS trial will take the next 4 years to complete and will likely have a price tag of nearly $1 million. We have been actively raising the funds needed to help get this study started, but we need your help to ensure that we have enough funding to take this trial to the finish line. Donations and fundraising efforts are currently being earmarked to support this trial, and should you be so inclined, we can use your help to fundraise for this initiative. If you are as excited about this project as we are and would like to contribute towards its success, you can use the QR code on this slide. I will also include a link in the chat so that you can learn more, donate, or get started fundraising to support this important clinical trial. The success of the VNS for PWS clinical trial relies on our PWS community, and I appreciate all of you for doing what you can to advance this potential treatment. With that, I'd like to move forward and answer any questions that you guys may have. I know that we have been talking for quite some time, so please feel free to use the Q&A and we will go through as many of your questions as possible.
We have a lot.
We do. We have a lot of questions. So I think the first question is really around wearing the device. How long does the device need to be worn for? Will they feel something when they're wearing the device? And at what times of day does the device need to be worn?
Sorry, you cut out for a while, but basically I didn't hear all the question, but I think it's how long and what time of day.
Correct.
Yeah, yes. I mean, it is fairly flexible. As Theresa said, it would be nice if it could be worn during sleep, but that hasn't been done. And there was a time when it was not recommended for a variety of reasons. So it should be during the time that you're awake. It can be worn when out. You can walk with it. You could work with it. You could do all those things. So really, it's very dependent on your life and how you can fit it into your day routine. I remember rightly, I think the person who we've been consulting more about this advised that it should never be worn for less than 15 minutes. Ideally, it should be probably no less than 30 minutes at a time. But I think in the study we did, we encouraged people to wear it at least in hourly blocks. Most of them, I think, wore it for the full 4 hours, usually in the evening. if they were, at meal times or watching TV or something like that. So it's flexible.
And Tony, I just wanted to, I see some questions about wearing it longer than 4 hours, and I don't know if we want to just address that since you're talking about the time.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think just to widen that a bit, I think one of the challenges in this area is to know what the right dose is, if you like, in terms of both hours of use as well as the type of stimulation, because you can change the intensity of stimulation, you could change a number of things. I mean, I think from our perspective, we want to keep fairly closely to what is recommended for those conditions where it's been approved, such as epilepsy and depression, because that just seems sensible, I think, to us. Although we are considering 2 arms to this trial, and one of them, it would be continuous stimulation over a period of 4 hours, and the others, it might be intermittent. So I think the answer is we don't know. I think I would avoid myself doing it going beyond 4 hours, because I think at present we don't know whether there would be an increased risk of side effects or whatever. But this is something, and Theresa, you might want to add to this, is something, as you know, Lauren, we've really been discussing with our colleagues in Germany who have been using this device. I think it's still a bit up in the air for us. So.
Yeah, I'll just say that we are trying to get input from all of the experts and, find a time that is consistent with the experience to date. So yeah, and also doing that 2 different arms with a slightly different stimulation, intermittent versus continuous. So, I think we will hopefully with this study start to address some of the issues around dosing of the stimulation, but it, will stay within the experience to date, probably.
What if the volunteer won't keep the device on? Are there any tricks to help with compliance?
Right. Should I start that one off? Or
You have the experience, Tony.
I mean, I think the first point to say about that is that we need to think very seriously about how we do optimize compliance. I think for our small study, to be honest, we didn't really think that through. We were lucky that we did get enough people to cooperate, that we had, some that completed the study. But I think in this larger study, it's going to be very important. I mean, I think the only thing we learned from the first study was probably, first of all, that routine is important. So if the person can accept it as part of a daily routine, just like they might accept some other aspect of their lives as part of a sort of daily routine, that's good. And we can have a discussion about this, whether it's appropriate to have some system of reward if they wear it. I think, now there is a sort of slight danger there that you bring in, I think, an additional intervention, if you like, which may confuse or confound the study itself. But I think that's the sort of thing we need to think about a bit more. I mean, I think in the longer term, I think there's an interesting issue that if you can show that this external device works and improves behavior, if you've got those people with Prader-Willi syndrome who have very bad behavior and refuse to use it, ultimately you might be able to justify, with their agreement, having an implanted device. There are ethical and legal issues to be considered there, but I think at the moment, if we can just at least show benefit in a much more sophisticated and robust way through this trial, then if those people who won't do it, there may be an alternative route that one could go down in the long term.
Mm-hmm. A lot of questions here about eligibility. Is there an opportunity for Canadians or Europeans to participate, or will this be limited to the US?
No, I think right now we're talking about US, UK, and Germany to get started. I mean, we don't want to make it, as you add countries, it gets complicated. So I think we can't do it everywhere, but we could consider if there are clinicians who would be interested in those countries. You know, I don't have the regulatory knowledge of device use in Canada, so we'd have to, you know, find someone who did. So Tony, did you want to comment further?
Yes, I mean, just to say that one of the interesting things is that actually the device has been approved by the European Medicines Agency for a number of things, but including Prader-Willi syndrome. They managed to slip that in with very limited evidence. I don't know quite how they did that, but it means that in Europe, well, I mean, okay, UK very sadly is outside the European Union now, but for those countries in the European Union, the regulation of the European Medicine Agency covers that. So within Europe, I think if there was someone who could oversee it and could do the ethics application and all that sort of the IRB application, then it would be possible because most of the data collection is going to be remote. I mean, there's issues around language and so on, but I think those are ones that could be overcome.
Mm-hmm. Another question, can I buy this device now and use it?
Right.
Depends on where you are. And I mean, if you're in Europe, yes, but we would love you to be part of the study so that we could understand how best to use it and understand the benefits and risks of it.
Yeah. And as Theresa, you were saying before, this study will help us understand dosing, which I think is important. So we would hope that people would participate to help us answer some of those questions.
And it's my understanding that there are no current guidelines for use necessarily for Prader-Willi syndrome. So in a clinical trial, you're working with a physician who's monitoring your care. That's important, especially when you're using a device that could potentially change behavior.
I think, and I do think it's important to have a note of caution here. I mean, I have to say, having known very well the participants in our study, I am very enthusiastic about it, but I also want to be cautious about it. I do think we've got to really seriously show that it's safe and that it's effective and what's the best dose. And we cannot at this stage be certain that if one gives, you know, if someone said, oh, I'll wear it for 6 hours a day because it's likely to have an even better effect, we just cannot be certain whether that will cause problems. We know that people with Prader-Willi syndrome, you know, they do have differences in terms of how their autonomic nervous system works. It's potentially possible that there would be unexpected side effects. So I think I would caution people, however needy you feel about this, just to be careful at the moment. I think the company doesn't like to sell devices without the approval of a physician. Mm-hmm. That was certainly the experience, because I had someone here in the UK ask me about that, and they wouldn't sell it to them without a physician agreeing that the person could try it. So I think that it might be difficult to buy. And in America at the moment, it isn't approved anyhow.
Right,
yeah.
Right.
I mean, in any of these drugs, I mean, I do think that, I mean, I understand the need for something today, but, you know, doing a controlled trial where safety and efficacy are being monitored is, you know, it's really important to the community. And, you know, we're going to try to be as efficient as possible. So hopefully we can get an answer as soon as possible.
And I think if you, I was just say one more thing about that, if you use it sort of off label, so to speak, or on your own, if it doesn't work, you don't necessarily know why, because maybe it's because you're using it a different parameter or using a different device, or it's stimulating a different area. So I do think it will be most useful to have the study and then have very specific guidelines about how to use it, what's most effective.
I think, Susan, there's another point to really emphasize here, and that is, if you go on the internet, there are many devices that claim to be stimulating the vagus nerve. And there's been a great debate, you know, about, and all of them will stimulate part of the ear, but different parts of the ear. And there's been debate about which part of the ear does the vagus nerve, the auricular branch of the vagus nerve stimulate. And I do know that there's been a small study that's been started in France, and they've used a different device. And my understanding is that they're not seeing an effect. But that device clips to a different part of the ear, this part here. And if you look at the limited data on this, the claim is that that's not where the auricular branch of the vagus nerve is. So you've got to be careful. Don't go to the internet and just pick any device and buy it, because it may be that device, even though it's claiming to stimulate the vagus nerve, is not stimulating the vagus nerve.
So Dr. Holland, you're describing my experience. So I'm going to be honest. When I first read your results, I thought to myself, I am going to go get a device. I'm going to put this on my son. So I started doing some research. I spent a lot of time doing research. And what I came up with was I had no idea what device to use. I had no idea how to put it on. And there was nowhere out in the literature that described how to use the device for Prader-Willi syndrome. No. So that's why it's really important to do this study. And for 50 or so lucky participants, you get to try this in a clinical trial setting with the monitoring of physicians, with limited travel. And Theresa, maybe you could tell us a little, do we know what the duration of the study might be and when we might be able to start enrolling patients?
I'm so reluctant to say that publicly. I mean, we're working on the protocol now. I mean, we want to get adequate input so everyone feels really comfortable that it's the best protocol, that we can put together. We will have to, the device is being we have to have the availability of the device. It is not available in the US today. We anticipate it will be. So all to say, I think towards the end of the year is when we're gearing up to start. But, I mean, these things, it depends on, there's a lot of moving parts. There's clinicians, there is regulatory agencies, and, so I don't want to commit exactly.
I think there's a really great question in the queue about the FDA and the time it takes to get new treatments approved. Can you perhaps touch on the approval process for a device versus a drug?
So devices have different approval standards than drugs do. And so it is a different process. Devices, my understanding, and obviously I'm not an expert in regulatory issues, but I'm trying to learn. For devices, the evidence for benefit has to outweigh the evidence for risk, which is different than the standards for drugs, which is that you have to show substantial evidence of efficacy, and then you have to show that the safety is acceptable. So it is a different process, and there are different approaches to approving devices than approving drugs. And I wouldn't say that it's easier, but the standards are a little bit more flexible for the devices.
Mm-hmm. Lots of questions about drugs and eligibility. So if my child is already on medications for anxiety or behaviors, am I eligible? That's part one.
Yes.
Yeah, although
it depends, but yeah.
Yeah, if your child's, for example, on an open label extension of an existing drug, that company may not want you to add a device to the mix. So there may be some restrictions that way, but I think by and large, because it is a device and not a drug, there's we don't have the exact inclusion exclusion criteria, but I think we'll be accepting most most drugs that will be acceptable. I don't know, Tony, if I'm not an MBA either. So.
Yeah, no, I think when we discussed it before, I think cardiovascular disease might be an exclusion criteria because the vagus nerve does act on the heart. There is a possibility that some drugs will be contraindicated, but at present we haven't, I think, finalized our thinking about that. I mean, just to say, I think if someone is on an existing treatment, providing it's acceptable for them also to have VNS, the only thing that we would ask really is that that treatment wasn't changed in the course of the trial. Unless there was a real clinical indication for that, because obviously we don't want some other change taking place, because then if things either got worse or got better, we don't know whether that's because of the medication change or because of VNS. So I think we would wish for consistency throughout the trial as far as is possible.
I think if patients are on, or individuals are on kind of approved psychiatric medications, that would likely not be an exclusion, because then we wouldn't have very many people to participate in the study.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Right, and presumably, even though they are on those medications, it's not controlling the outbursts, because that is a, you know, and you have to be having outbursts in order to measure that they go away. So, you know, that's the sort of important inclusion criteria there.
But there would need to be no changes in that medication. They would have to be on a stable dose for a period of time.
Right. And we understand that, you know, I mean, sometimes you have to change things, but at least going into the trial, if you don't anticipate that there will be changes.
I think the other thing, and this came up, I noticed something in the chat that relates to this. I think if there was someone that was actively mentally unwell at the time, probably they wouldn't be included in the trial, because then you've got the complication of knowing whether the behavioral problems were really secondary to the mental illness, or whether they were, if you like, the standard behavior problems associated with Prader-Willi syndrome. If you have a history but you're mentally well, I don't think that's a problem. But if you were mentally unwell at the time, I think that would almost certainly be an exclusion criteria.
We mentioned that this study will be primarily virtual, but some travel will be required. Do we have a list of cities that this study may be part of?
So in the US, we've discussed it with the PWS Clinical Investigation Collaborative, which is a group of about 25 clinicians across the US who are involved in PWS care. And there was a lot of interest from that group. We don't have final sites yet, but you know, there were you know, I would say at least 10 different clinics that expressed an interest. So I think we'll have good involvement of different sites across the US, but it's not been finalized yet.
I have a lot of people who are interested in how can they enroll, or when will they be able to enroll? How should they find more information?
It's not a satisfying answer. I apologize, but you know, just give us a little bit of time. You know, we wanted to get this out to the community so that, you know, you all would be aware that it's coming, maybe answer some questions about the general approach. And, you know, again, we anticipate the study being finalized in the coming months and hopefully launched before the end of the year. And, you know, we will just, you'll see it on the website and, you know, in our emails and things like that. So, so we won't hide it for sure.
Absolutely. And you can expect, if you registered for this webinar, you will receive information on the trial when it does come open by email, as well as on our website and social media. There was a lot of questions that came in today. We did our best to answer as many of them as we could. I'd like to thank everyone for attending our webinar today. I really hope you found it informative and are as excited as I am about this potential treatment. So should you have any questions about VNS or our fundraising efforts, please feel free to email us at research@fpwr.org. And once again, I would love to thank our panelists, Dr. Holland, Dr. Schwartz, and Dr. Strong, for sharing this amazing project with us and really making it possible for us. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.